We are still on the South Skirmish line, lower segment, looking at Deep Ravine, and I want to briefly go into the aftermath of the event. After the Custer fight was over, the Indians began to move back towards the Reno-Benteen defense site, and as I discussed earlier in the Reno Hill/Weir Point segments, the Indians surrounded the soldiers on Reno Hill and kept them pinned down for the next day and a half, until finally on June 27th, to the amazement of the soldiers, the Indians packed up, pulled out, and began moving south down toward the Bighorn Mountains, which are right here on the horizon. The Indians burned the fields as they went to make a smokescreen, and also to keep the soldiers from being able to feed their horses and chase after the Indians. Of course, as we all know, the soldiers were in no condition to pursue anybody, so they just kind of watched the Indians pull away. They weren't really sure why the Indians were doing this. And then they realized later in the day that another dust cloud was coming from the north. This was the Terry Gibbon column finally arriving on the scene. Difficult terrain had slowed their movement, so they were a day and a half behind schedule at this point. They came on down and discovered the Custer dead first. They moved farther down and found Reno and Benteen entrenched on the hill 4 miles to the south, and basically relieved the beleaguered command. The next day, the united commands came back up here and found the dead and buried them all. They had about 8 shovels among them, so it was a pretty tough business. Most of the dead were left where they had fallen. Scoops of dirt were dug up on both sides of the bodies and thrown over them. Only the Custer brothers, George and Tom, got anything close to an actual burial. They were wrapped in a blanket, placed beside each other, and buried in a shallow grave 18 inches deep. The burial process was a hasty endeavor because at that time, the wounded, which numbered near 60, were the priority at this point. General Terry wanted to get the wounded to the steamer Far West as soon as possible, so they moved north after the burials were completed and found the Far West anchored at the confluence of the Bighorn and Little Bighorn rivers. The Far West then steamed down the Bighorn, got to the Yellowstone, steamed down the Yellowstone to the Missouri, and then followed the Missouri all the way down and finally reached Fort Abraham Lincoln, which was south of present-day Bismarck, North Dakota. Despite the defeat, the Army did not end their operations immediately. Both Terry and Crook continued to hunt down the Indians, without luck for the most part. The 7th Cavalry likewise remained in the field until early September before finally going back to Fort Abraham Lincoln. Now, the historic irony of this battle, the Little Bighorn, is that the Indians won the battle, but they lost the war. The Army had been fighting this war with basically one arm tied behind its back, and it took a disaster, the Custer defeat here, for that army to just simply break out that other arm and fight the war with 2 hands, which it finally did. As for the Indians that had left this valley in victory, they had continued down toward the Bighorn Mountains. They actually had a few more casualties. People that were wounded in the fight had died, and they were put up on burial scaffolds at the foot of the Bighorn Mountains, to the south here. Then the Indians, as they moved, band by band, peeled off, and this large camp just basically disintegrated and disappeared into the terrain. Crazy Horse took his band into the Wolf Mountains. Sitting Bull and his people ended up in the Tongue River Valley before moving north and eventually reaching Canada. And various other bands went back into the Powder River country, into the Black Hills, or back to the agency reservations. The cavalry, reinforced, just brought crushing forces to bear against these Indians. The Indians would never again come together in the numbers that they had at the Little Bighorn. This was their high water mark. And like I said, the cavalry came out here and began to chase the Indians throughout the fall of 1876. There were small clashes here and there, but the Indians, for the most part, were able to evade the military forces chasing them. But evasion only slowed the process of their eventual defeat. The soldiers would not allow the Indians to sleep, they wouldn't let them eat or hunt, And basically what they did was they ran them into the ground. And within a year of this battle, almost all the Indians, to a man, that had fought here, and that includes the non-combatants, had come back to the reservations because they were exhausted and starving, and they surrendered to the armies. Crazy Horse was one of them. He surrendered in 1877 at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and was confined for a short period of time before being released. He actually signed on to become a scout for the Army, but he was killed while attempting to escape another confinement order. Sitting Bull remained up in Canada for several years, not returning until 1881, and his people were starving as well and freezing up in Canada every winter. And Sitting Bull became embroiled in reservation politics, and he fought with James McLaughlin, who was the Standing Rock Indian agent. Now, as the years go on, the Sioux, as a collective, their spirits drop due to the reservation life, inferior food, and disease. And it is around 1890 that a Paiute shaman named Wavoka appears on the scene. He brings hope to the Indians with a vision of the ghost dance. It was basically a promise that they could return to their old way of life if the people would join in the ghost dance movement. This cause begins to grow, and the ghost dance movement eventually spreads throughout all of the Sioux agencies. Sitting Bull was not one of the followers, but he did not do anything to stop it either. This scared McLaughlin, the Indian agents, and the other whites in and around the reservations, so they requested help and protection from the Army to deal with this problem. They feared that there might be an uprising. In 1890, feeling that Sitting Bull was behind this, Agent McLaughlin actually ordered the arrest of Sitting Bull. However, Sitting Bull resisted, and a crowd outside his cabin fired on the Indian police that were trying to make the arrest. The police fired back into the crowd, and several people on both sides were killed, Sitting Bull being one of them. This event heightened tensions immeasurably, and it was soon after this that the 7th Cavalry located a large contingent of ghost dancers camped on Wounded Knee Creek. The cavalry surrounded the camp on 3 sides and then moved in and attempted to disarm the Indians. Both sides were visibly nervous, and when a gunshot went off, it sparked a general response. The Indians, many of them women and children, ran for cover, but to no avail. The officers lost control of the fight, and their men chased after the Indians, and the fight degenerated into a buffalo hunt. When it was all said and done, over 30 soldiers had been killed or wounded, and over 200 Sioux had died. It was a symbolic end to the Indian Wars, and it proved to every Indian on the reservation that their way of life was indeed over.